Chapter 6. Solomon looked over the empty shelves and the large oak desk that the servants had just finished moving into his private study. The old room, with its high ceilings and tall windows, had sat vacant for many years, collecting layers of dust that muted the once vibrant hues of the tapestries lining the walls. He did not wish to command the realm from his brother's throne. That would be a step too far, he told himself, a breach of the delicate truce that held the kingdom together. Here, in this secluded sanctuary, he could be left alone to work and govern the kingdom as he saw fit. He ran his hand across the polished surface of the desk, feeling the cool, smooth grain beneath his fingers. When he lifted his hand, a thin veil of dust clung to his skin, a tangible reminder of the years of neglect. Solomon had always found solace in books, in the tales they spun of far-off places and the strange wonders hidden in the corners of the known world. He envisioned the empty shelves brimming with leather-bound volumes, their spines cracked and well-worn from frequent use. The room would be transformed into a haven of knowledge, a testament to his thirst for wisdom and understanding. As he stood there, memories of his mother flooded his mind. He could still picture her, seated in a sunlit alcove of the palace garden, her long, slender fingers tracing the lines of a book while he nestled in her lap. Her soft voice would weave the words into vivid images, her golden hair cascading over his small shoulders as she read. The scent of her jasmine perfume mingled with the earthy aroma of aged parchment, creating a sensory tapestry that anchored him to those precious moments. While Otto, his older brother, had been off with their father, learning the art of wielding a sword and commanding men, Solomon had found his refuge in his mother's embrace. He could still recall the warmth of her smile, a radiant beacon of love and reassurance. The gardens had been their playground, the lush green grass a cushion for their afternoons of storytelling and laughter, Solomon allowing the memory to envelop him. He could almost feel the gentle caress of the breeze that rustled through the leaves, hear the distant chirping of birds hidden in the foliage. Those moments had been a sanctuary, a world apart from the duties and expectations that now weighed heavily on his shoulders. Opening his eyes, he surveyed the empty room once more. The study was a blank canvas, waiting to be filled with the relics of his past and the tools of his future. He envisioned maps unfurled across the desk, ink pots and quills at the ready for drafting letters and decrees. The flickering light of a candle would cast shadows that danced on the walls, adding to the room's quiet mystique. He took a deep breath, drawing in the musty scent of the old room. It was a smell that spoke of time and history, of forgotten secrets and untold stories. He felt a renewed sense of purpose, a determination to forge his path not in the shadow of his brother's throne, but in the light of his own intellect and compassion. This study would be the heart of his reign, a place where he could draw strength from the memories of his mother and the wisdom of the ages. He sat down at his desk, the solid wood creaking slightly under his weight. He brushed the dust away with the back of his sleeve, the particles floating lazily in the sunlight streaming through the tall windows. At the heavy wooden door, Sir Matthew, clad in his gleaming armor, let the first visitor in. The man who entered was elderly, his hunched frame clad in plain grey robes that spoke of a life devoted to labor rather than luxury. His eyes, filled with a mix of trepidation and curiosity, were fixed on Solomon as he approached the desk. "Master Kellen," Sir Matthew announced with a slight bow, and then stepped back, standing guard by the door. Solomon motioned for the old man to come closer. He passed a piece of parchment across the table to Kellen, who took it with hands that trembled slightly. Whether from age or nervousness was unclear. The edges of the parchment crinkled under his grip, leaving faint sweat marks where his fingers pressed. "I'm told you are the best swordsmith in Sandoria," Solomon said with a tone of authority that left little room for doubt. Kellen nodded, his eyes briefly meeting Solomon's before darting back to the paper. "The men in my family have been crafting blades since the days of Aden," he replied, his voice wavering with a mix of pride and apprehension. Solomon's lips curved into a small smile as he pointed at the parchment. "Good. I want you to craft me a blade unlike any other. I lost my old sword recently, and am in need of another one." Kellen unfolded the paper carefully, revealing a design sketched in black ink. His eyes widened as he took in the intricate details. A hilt of gold, fashioned in the shape of a dragon's head, the guard formed by the beast's wings, and the blade itself emerging from the dragon's mouth like a fiery breath. The lines were bold and confident, yet the complexity of the design was evident. "It is very complicated," Kellen admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "It will take me some time to craft such a blade." Solomon nodded, his expression resolute. "Take all the time you need. I expect you to craft me a blade worthy of the 500. Kellen bowed deeply, his respect and commitment clear in the gesture. He carefully tucked the piece of paper back into his pocket, smoothing the fabric as if the action would steady his nerves. As the old swordsmith turned to leave, Solomon leaned back in his chair, watching him go with a sense of satisfaction. The study, once empty and neglected, was already becoming a place of purpose and action. "Sir Matthew," Solomon said, turning his gaze to his loyal knight, "ensure that Master Kellen has everything he needs. No expense is to be spared in the crafting of this blade." "Yes, my lord," Sir Matthew replied with a respectful nod, his armor clinking softly as he moved to carry out the order. Solomon sat at his desk, quill in hand, preparing to write a series of letters when the next man entered the room. It was Eric, the Queen's brother, striding forward with a determined gait. His tunic, a light, dusty green, contrasted sharply with his dark brown hair. His calm eyes, however, were simmering with anger as they locked onto Solomon. Without a word, Eric tossed a parchment onto the desk, the force causing the ink bottle to tremble slightly. Solomon looked up, meeting Eric's steely gaze. "Bread is skyrocketing in the marketplace. Mothers are struggling to feed their children." "There is no food, Solomon," Eric said, his voice edged with frustration and urgency. Solomon brushed the parchment aside, his expression impassive. "The wheat from the fields will be harvested soon. Our allies in Capria and the Stormlands are sending us fresh supplies as well. I will send Sir Matthew and his men to the market to ensure fair prices on the goods there." Eric remained stoic, his jaw clenched. Solomon could sense the tension radiating from him, a silent but powerful indictment of his leadership. "Is there something else?" Solomon asked, his voice growing colder. "People are starving and dying while you draw up designs for fancy golden swords," Eric retorted, his voice filled with barely contained fury. Solomon's hand tightened around the quill, the nib threatening to snap under the pressure. He forced himself to remain composed, though a vein in his temple throbbed. "The priests say that you are cursed, that the goddess will punish you for your crimes," Eric said, his voice low but steady, the words cutting through the air like a blade. Solomon's eyes darkened, a storm brewing behind them. The weight of Eric's accusation hung heavily in the room, thickening the air. He took a slow, deep breath, trying to quell the rising tide of anger within him. "Cursed?" Solomon repeated, his voice a dangerous whisper. He stood up, the chair scraping against the floor. "What crimes, Eric? Is it a crime to seek peace and prosperity for our kingdom, to ensure we have the means to defend ourselves?" Eric's eyes narrowed, his posture unyielding. "The priests speak of the blood you have shed, of the alliances you have broken. They say the goddess sees all and will not be merciful." Solomon's hands, now trembling slightly, gripped the edge of the desk. He glanced at the door, half expecting Sir Matthew to burst in, sword drawn, ready to defend him against this insidious threat. But the room remained still, the tension crackling like a summer thunderstorm on the horizon. "Eric," Solomon said, his voice now a mixture of weariness and resolve, "I am doing what I must to save this kingdom. The sword you mock is not just a weapon, it is a symbol, a beacon of hope and strength." "And what of the people?" Eric countered, his voice rising. "What good is a symbol if the people it is meant to protect are dying in the streets?" Solomon stared at Eric, seeing not just a man, but the embodiment of the kingdom's desperation and fear. He took a step back, his mind racing. The priests, the people, even his own family, doubt and discontent were spreading like wildfire. "I will address the priests," Solomon said finally, his voice steadying. "I will speak to them and find a way to make amends. As for the people, I will do everything in my power to ensure they do not starve. You have my word." Eric's expression softened slightly, but his eyes remained guarded. "Actions, Solomon, not words. Show them that you care, that you are more than just a ruler with grand designs." Solomon nodded, the gravity of Eric's words sinking in. "I will," he promised, though he did not mean it. These people owed everything to his brother for defending them. If some of them had to starve so that the rest could live, it would be a small sacrifice. And what if the goddess cursed him? He was the chancellor, the brother to the king. He was the second most powerful man on earth. The goddess wanted to punish him. Let the bitch try. "There is something else," Eric admitted, his voice dropping low, barely more than a whisper. He leaned in closer, his expression shifting from anger to something graver, more urgent. Solomon looked up from the parchment, his eyes narrowing as he listened intently. "There are reports coming in that someone is leading the Phantom Fist on the outskirts of our borders," Eric continued, his tone laden with dread. "They're burning villages, killing the people, and taking the women and children off as slaves." A cold shiver ran down Solomon's spine. He straightened in his chair, his full attention now fixed on Eric. "A giant of a man wielding a two-handed great sword and wearing black armor is leading them," Eric added, his voice barely above a murmur, as if speaking the words aloud would give them more power. Solomon's mind raced. He could see the man in his mind's eye, towering, a fearsome figure whose very presence could freeze the blood of even the bravest warrior. He shook his head, his voice steady and factual. "No. Matthew and I killed him. We cut down that giant ourselves. These reports must be old." Eric shrugged, uncertainty clouding his features. "The reports are recent, Solomon. They come from different sources, all consistent." Solomon's eyes darkened as he processed this information. He shook his head again, more vigorously this time, as if trying to dispel the impossible notion. "The dead do not rise again," he said firmly, his voice carrying an edge of finality. Eric held his gaze, the silence between them heavy with unspoken fears. "Well," he said, his voice a grim echo of the dread that had settled in the room, "this one has." Solomon's mind reeled. The man they had killed was a monster, a towering figure of terror who had left a trail of devastation in his wake. The memory of that battle was seared into his mind and his flesh. The clash of steel, the stench of blood, the roar of the giant as he fell, finally defeated. The thought that he might have returned, leading the Phantom Fist once more, was a nightmare made real. Solomon touched his side where his scar from that battle remained. He felt a surge of anger and helplessness. The kingdom was already teetering on the edge, and now this spectre from the past threatened to push it over. He stopped pacing and turned to face Eric, his expression resolute. "We need to verify these reports. I will not have the kingdom thrown into chaos by rumors and fear. Sir Matthew and I will ride out to the eastern borderlands ourselves. We will find the truth." Eric nodded, relief and concern mingling in his eyes. "Be careful, Solomon. If this is truly the same man, he will be more dangerous than ever." Solomon clenched his fist. "We killed him once," he said, his voice hard as steel. "We will do it again." As Eric turned to leave, Solomon sat back down, the weight of the kingdom pressing heavily on his shoulders. He grabbed tightly at the scar on his side. He was no warrior. He had fought the giant once before and almost died. He could not bear to face the beast of a man again. Glanced at the parchments on the desk, the intricate sketches of the sword on them, and for a moment he questioned whether he was truly fit to wield it. Solomon walked the castle grounds that afternoon, the heat oppressive and unrelenting. The sun hung high in the sky, its rays scorching the rocky terrain of the barren land surrounding the fortress. Sweat trickled down his temples as his thoughts swirled in a relentless storm, each demanding his attention and weighing heavily on his mind. He paused by the edge of a stone balcony, looking down onto the training yard below. Sir Matthew, his trusted knight and confidant, stood in the center, drilling a batch of fresh recruits. The sound of clashing practice swords and shouted commands filled the air, mingling with the dusty heat that shimmered above the ground. The yard was a hive of activity. Young men, barely more than boys, strained under the weight of wooden practice swords, their faces flushed with exertion and determination. They moved clumsily, their inexperience evident in their awkward stances and fumbling strikes. But there was a spark in their eyes, a burning desire to prove themselves, to earn a place among the kingdom's defenders. Solomon watched them with a mix of pride and apprehension. The kingdom had been low on able-bodied men for some time, the demands of war and hardship having taken their toll. But the promise of fresh bread and a steady pay had drawn these young men from their villages and farms, eager to pick up swords and train to become future knights. As he observed them, his mind drifted to the rumors Eric had brought him. If the reports of the Phantom Fist were true, he would soon need every one of these young men. The thought filled him with a cold dread that contrasted sharply with the blistering heat of the day. The recruits' faces were streaked with sweat and dust, their brows furrowed in concentration as they followed Sir Matthew's commands. Their movements were stiff and uncoordinated, but Solomon saw potential in their earnest efforts. He knew that with time and training, they could become the backbone of his army, the defenders of his realm. Yet, as he watched them, another thought gnawed at him, a shadow from the past. He couldn't help but think of his master of spies, a man who had once been his most trusted advisor and confidant. The master of spies had possessed a keen intellect and an uncanny ability to gather information from the most obscure and secretive corners of the kingdom. His network of informants had been vast and efficient, providing Solomon with invaluable insights and clarity in times of uncertainty. If the master of spies were still here, Solomon thought, he might have already unraveled the mystery of the border raids. He might have identified the truth behind the rumors of the giant in black armor, offering strategies and solutions instead of questions and fears. But the master of spies was gone, and he had no one to blame but himself for the man's betrayal. And he had died at Solomon's own hands. The yard below echoed with the sounds of training, the recruits' shouts and the clatter of wooden swords punctuating the heavy air. Solomon's gaze shifted from face to face, seeing in them the future of his kingdom. He felt a pang of responsibility, a weight that seemed to grow with each passing day. These young men trusted him to lead, to protect, and to guide them through the trials ahead. He could not afford to fail them. As he turned to leave the balcony, Solomon made a silent vow. He would not let the kingdom fall into chaos. He would find a way to uncover the truth behind the border attacks, to protect his people from the looming threat. He would honor the legacy of those who had served him, drawing strength from their memory as he faced the challenges ahead. With renewed determination, Solomon descended the stone steps of the castle, heading toward the training yard. He needed to speak with Sir Matthew, to prepare for the journey to the eastern borderlands. The sun continued its relentless assault on the land, but within Solomon burned a fire of resolve that no heat could extinguish. Solomon stood before Sir Matthew and drew a wooden practice sword from the nearly empty rack. The weight of it felt strange in his hand, a stark reminder of how unfamiliar he was with combat despite his position. Sir Matthew stroked his black beard thoughtfully, his eyes narrowing in contemplation. The young recruits, sensing the unusual tension, paused their training to watch. Solomon faced his most trusted knight, weapon drawn, his heart pounding in his chest. He had only ever been in 2 real fights in his life and had nearly died in both. The memories of those battles haunted him, a constant reminder of his vulnerability. He needed this. He needed to become stronger. "Come at me," he commanded, his voice a savage growl. The urgency in his tone left no room for misunderstanding. Sir Matthew did not move, his expression one of concern and reluctance. "My lord, you are the Chancellor. There is no need for this." "There is every need," Solomon insisted, his eyes blazing with determination. Matthew let out a tired sigh, the weight of his responsibility pressing heavily upon him. "Very well, as my lord commands," he said, drawing his real sword with practiced ease. The young recruits watched in awe as Sir Matthew moved with a fluid grace, his blade flashing in the sunlight. In a blur of motion, he struck Solomon, knocking him down with a single precise blow. The impact sent Solomon sprawling in the dust, the breath knocked from his lungs. Pain shot through his body, but he gritted his teeth and forced himself back to his feet, the wooden sword clutched tightly in his hand. He needed this, he reminded himself. He needed to prove to himself and to his men that he could stand and fight. Solomon and Matthew clashed again, their blades ringing out across the hot, dusty training yard. The recruits watched in stunned silence, their eyes wide with amazement. Matthew's real sword slowly chipped away at Solomon's wooden one, turning it to splinters with each powerful strike. Again Matthew knocked Solomon down, his blade swift and merciless. "Stay down this time," the knight suggested, pointing his blade at Solomon's chest, his voice a mix of command and concern. But Solomon was having none of it. The fire in his eyes burned brighter, fueled by a deep-seated need to push beyond his limits. He rose again, his body aching but his spirit unbroken. He readied his splintered sword, the resolve in his stance unmistakable. "You have to stop this," Matthew said, his voice a blend of frustration and admiration. "You're not a warrior, Solomon." "I must become one," Solomon replied, his voice unwavering. "For the kingdom, I must." The two men clashed again, Solomon's strikes wild and desperate against Matthew's calculated and controlled movements. Each time Solomon fell, he rose again, his determination unyielding. The recruits watched in awe and horror, witnessing their chancellor's relentless pursuit of strength. The sun beat down mercilessly, the heat intensifying with each passing minute. Dust and sweat clung to Solomon's skin, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. Matthew's strikes were precise, chipping away at Solomon's resolve as much as his weapon. Finally, with a powerful swing, Matthew shattered Solomon's wooden sword completely, the splinters flying through the air. Solomon fell to his knees, exhausted and battered, but his eyes still burning with that fierce determination. Matthew stood over him, his blade lowered. "You have heart, Solomon," he said softly. "But this is not your path. Your strength lies in your wisdom, in your leadership." Solomon looked up at his knight, his chest heaving. "My wisdom means nothing if I cannot protect my people," he said, his voice hoarse but resolute. Matthew extended a hand, helping Solomon to his feet. "Then let us ensure you can," he said. "Together." The recruits, witnessing this exchange, felt a newfound respect for their chancellor. They saw not a man of mere words, but one willing to fight and bleed for his people. Solomon's determination had left an indelible mark on them, a testament to his unyielding spirit. The sun began to dip towards the horizon, casting long shadows across the training yard. Solomon retired from the yard that evening, his body aching and sore from the intense training session. Every muscle protested as he made his way to the castle's bathhouse, where he stripped off his dusty clothes and dumped a bucket of cold water over himself. The shock of the cold water sent a shiver through his body, but it was refreshing, helping to wash away the grime and tension of the day. He scrubbed vigorously, removing the sand and dirt, feeling the fatigue start to ease slightly. After he had cleaned himself, Solomon dressed in his best red tunic, the rich fabric a stark contrast to the utilitarian garments he had worn earlier. He carefully pinned the golden dragon to his chest, ensuring it was polished to a brilliant shine. Stepping out into the cooling evening air, Solomon made his way to the gardens. The memories of his childhood flooded back as he walked along the familiar paths. He could almost see his younger self running through the green grass, his mother's laughter echoing in his ears, her long fingers threading through his golden hair as she read him stories. He found a secluded spot near a cluster of blooming roses and waited, the soft rustle of leaves and the distant chirping of crickets the only sounds around him. Soon, he heard the light footsteps approaching. Alicia appeared, her long black hair cascading down her back, unbound and free. She wore a red silk dress that clung to her curves, the fabric shimmering in the soft light of the torches that the servants were lighting along the paths. Solomon's breath caught in his throat as he watched her approach. Alicia moved with a grace and confidence that captivated him, her beauty radiant in the twilight. He struggled to maintain his composure, blushing slightly as she came to a stop in front of him. "I received your invitation," she said, her voice soft and melodic. "I see that," he responded, his voice tinged with awe as he took in the sight of her. "Thank you for coming." Alicia smiled, a knowing look in her eyes. "I was curious to see what was so important that it couldn't wait until morning." Solomon offered his arm and they began to walk along the garden path, the stars gradually appearing in the night sky above them. The gentle flicker of torchlight illuminated their way, casting a warm, golden glow. They walked in silence for a few moments, the fragrant scent of the roses and night-blooming flowers enveloping them. Solomon felt a sense of calm wash over him, the presence of Elysia and the familiarity of the gardens grounding him. "How are you and the boy holding up?" Solomon asked, his voice tinged with genuine concern. Elysia shrugged, her expression a mixture of weariness and determination. "My son is climbing up and down the castle walls and towers. He seems to think it's all a grand adventure." Solomon chuckled softly, imagining the boy's antics. "So, what will you do now?" Elysia's gaze grew distant, uncertainty clouding her eyes. "Rebuild my tavern, I guess. Start over." "Do you have the resources for that?" Solomon inquired, his tone cautious yet hopeful. A sly smile played on her lips as she brushed a long strand of black hair out of her eyes. "I know some people," she replied, her voice carrying a hint of mischief. He nodded thoughtfully. "If you need help—" Her eyebrows shot up in surprise. "From you?" "No, that won't be necessary." "I have access to many resources," Solomon told her confidently, trying to bridge the gap between them. Elysia's expression hardened. "Yes, I've watched your men taking the tax from people who can't afford to eat. I'm sure you have plenty." The words stung, and Solomon felt a pang of guilt. As they walked, she pulled her arm away from him, her demeanor growing colder. "I have many friends in this city," she continued, her voice firm. "Your help will not be needed." They reached the center of the garden, where a long wooden table laden with food awaited them. The spread was opulent, a feast meant to impress and seduce. Elysia turned her nose up at it, her gaze shifting back to Solomon with a look of disdain. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice icy. "I just thought—" Solomon began, his voice trailing off as he realized his mistake. "I won't eat your food or be romanced by you," Elysia interrupted, taking a step away from him. Her eyes were fierce, her posture defensive. Solomon's heart sank. "I'm grateful that you saved me," she admitted, her voice softening just a fraction. "But I owe you nothing, and I want nothing from you." "Your men killed my people and threw my comrades in jail for feeding the needy," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "Catpad and I will be leaving in the morning." Solomon's mind raced. He touched his lips softly with his fingers. "You kissed me that night outside your tavern. I just thought—" "I kiss a lot of men," she reminded him, her face turning red as she blushed. "It was a mistake. Forget about it." "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't realize the rumors about you were true." Elysia's expression softened slightly, but there was still a wall between them. "It's too late for apologies, Solomon. How else do you think a mother can provide for her son in this damn city? You think you are the first man I've romanced to get what I want." She shook her head. "I need to protect my son, to build a life for us, and I will do that without your help." Solomon watched as she turned and walked away, her figure retreating into the shadows of the garden. He felt a profound sense of loss, not just for Elysia's rejection, but for the realization of how disconnected he had become from the very people he was supposed to protect and serve. He stood there for a long moment, the scent of the garden flowers mingling with the cool night air. The lavish feast before him now seemed grotesque. Elysia's words hung in the air, her rejection and accusations cutting deeper than any blade. Anger and frustration bubbled up inside him, a storm of emotions he could no longer contain. In a sudden, explosive moment, he grabbed the edge of the opulent table and overturned it, sending platters of food crashing to the ground. The sound of breaking dishes and the sight of the lavish feast spilling into the garden filled the air, a chaotic echo of his inner turmoil. Breathing heavily, Solomon watched as the carefully prepared banquet lay in ruins. He felt a surge of bitterness and anger, directed both at himself and at her. What a fool he had been to go to such effort for a woman who clearly wanted nothing to do with him. "She was a rebel, of course she wants nothing to do with you, fool," he told himself. Did you think she would love you for saving her? Damn fool. His father had never had this trouble. Garin had been a strong man with an iron will, his wife a high-born noble woman. That man would not have thought twice about the opinion of some tavern girl, he told himself. With clenched fists and a heart heavy with resentment, Solomon walked off into the night, his footsteps echoing through the empty garden paths. The cool night air did little to soothe the heat of his anger as he replayed the conversation in his mind. Alicia's disdain, her cutting remarks about his men and his rule, stung deeply. He had wanted to show her kindness, to make amends, but instead he had only succeeded in widening the chasm between them. The stars above seemed indifferent to his plight, twinkling serenely in the night sky as if mocking his turmoil. The shadows of the castle loomed around him, silent witnesses to his frustration and sense of failure. Solomon's thoughts churned, each one darker and more bitter than the last. He had been trying to be a better leader, a more compassionate ruler, but all his efforts seemed to fall short. As he wandered through the quiet, moonlit courtyards, Solomon felt a growing resolve harden within him. He had been a fool, yes, but not just for trying to impress Alicia. He had been a fool for losing sight of what truly mattered, the well-being of his people. He couldn't change the past, but he could strive to make amends for the future. He stopped by the edge of a fountain, the cool water reflecting the night sky. He stared into its depths, the rippling surface mirroring his troubled thoughts. He needed to find a way to bridge the gap between his intentions and his actions, to ensure that his rule was marked by justice and compassion rather than fear and resentment. Otherwise, it would only be a matter of time before someone killed him. With a deep breath, Solomon straightened up, the anger still simmering but now tempered by a sense of purpose. He would address the injustices within his kingdom, starting with the plight of the needy and the oppressed. He would hold his men accountable for their actions and ensure that the taxes were fair and that those in need were cared for. And his brother. Otto would need the supplies from Sandoria badly. He shook his head. Otto would have to find a way to supply his own men. Solomon turned away from the fountain, his mind clearer now. The path ahead was difficult and fraught with challenges, but he was determined to walk it. For his kingdom, for his people, and perhaps one day, to earn the respect of those like Alicia, who had suffered under his rule. As he made his way back into the castle, the overturned table and the spilled feast were left behind in the garden, a silent testament to his renewed resolve. Solomon knew that actions, not words, would define his legacy, and he was ready to begin that journey anew.